All right, go for it, Jill.
Continue. Okay. Okay, so how I've set this up is that I'm just going to talk to you a bit about applying for jobs in general, and then, but I do want you to interrupt me if you've got any questions at any time, okay? How you're going to interrupt me is not completely clear to me because I'm sharing my screen. So I'm going to ask Amanda to manage that. Okay, so Amanda, if anyone wants to ask a question, I will give you time to ask questions. Can you, because I don't know how to tell who's asking the question otherwise.
You can just put it in the chat if you like.
But I can't even see the chat.
Oh, no, I'll look at it.
Oh, you'll look at it. Okay. Yeah. So if you want to ask a question, just put a message in the chat to Amanda. Okay, so CVs, application letters and selection criteria, how to make yours stand out. Well, why is this important? I'll skip the overview. Why is this important? Because, oh God. Sorry, I've just got to get rid of everybody. There we go. Positions that come up, as you know, only too well, are quite rare. And so when we advertise a position, what tends to happen is that if it's a continuing position, we will get no less than 80 applications from across the world for that position. If it's a non-continuing position, there'll be fewer, but there are often still a lot, especially if it's more than a year or two. And so when the selection committee gets together for the first meeting, they're greeted with 100 or 80, 100, whatever applications. And those applications are not short. They tend to be pretty long because they need to, they need to have their application letter, they need to address the selection criteria, and they need to have the CV. And people like to make their CVs long because it looks like they've done more. So what's the first thing that happens is that the people reading these applications are going to go through those applications and look for ways of excluding people without having to actually read the entire application. So one way of doing this, for example, is if you don't have a PhD completed, you probably won't be considered. You may be considered if your PhD is actually submitted and under examination, but you'll need to make a really strong case for it. If your PhD is not yet submitted and you say, I'm going to submit this in 3 months' time, that won't necessarily count, because I know of situations where people have been offered a job, they were going to submit their PhD in 3 months' time, but the PhD never made it. So you need to be really careful that your application hangs together really well. Assuming you all have PhDs, you must address the selection criteria, because if you don't address the selection criteria in Australia, and this applies only in Australia, like I think that other universities in the UK, Europe and the US probably don't ask for selection criteria in the way we do, but we ask specifically for selection criteria, and you must address each one of those selection criteria. So that's a critical aspect of your application as well. Oh, this is not, I've got the wrong PowerPoint here because I changed this next slide. And hang on, I'm just going to close this because I've got the wrong PowerPoint. If you just excuse me for a second, if I can work out how to do it. How do I do this? Oh, stop share.
While Jill's doing that, I can go ahead and say, if you want to ask a question, you could do it in a variety of ways. One, you could type your entire question into the chat and I could read it out to Jill. Otherwise, you could just type, say, question or the letter Q or something into the chat, and then I could just say, Jill, so-and-so has a question, and then you could say it yourself. Either way is great.
Oh, there you all are. Hello. Okay, just let me close this down. and open the correct version. I don't know what's going on here. Okay. So these are the kinds of things that the members of the selection committee are going to look at. They're not going to look at these when they're all sitting together in a room. They're going to look at these individually before they get to sit together in a room. So they're going to look at, you know, do they meet the requirements of the job? Can they teach the subjects that they require to be taught? And to what extent can they demonstrate that they've published? And is their research in an area of interest that will fit with the interests of the discipline in that particular institution? So all of these things you need to consider before you begin your application, and you need to address them. So before you start applying for a job, the most important thing is that your application letter needs to be succinct, and it needs to address the points raised in the job advertisement specifically. So it needs to be written for this particular job, and it should be written for this particular job alone. And I say this because I'm sure this won't apply to, hang on a sec, let's shut the door. There's people talking about here. Sorry, I just got rid of them. It needs to address this job alone. Don't use the same letter for multiple jobs. Write a new letter for each job so that you can make sure it's specifically tailored. It's important to choose your referees carefully. When you're sitting on a selection committee and you receive letters from referees, it's always a good thing if you know one or two of the referees, because you know what they're like as people, or if they're people who are well known in the discipline. So choosing your referees carefully is very important. For most of you, having completed, well, I don't know, I can't ask now, but I don't know how many of you have completed PhDs and how many haven't, but your examiners are often good referees, and it's worth and I'm sure that you all do this, but I always ask my students to write to their examiners after the examination process is completed, when they know who their examiners are, and to thank them for their comments and to ask if they would like a hard copy of their thesis sent to them. So it's a very good opportunity to make contact with your examiners, and your examiners are down the track potentially going to prove to be good referees. Obviously, your supervisor can also be and should also be a referee for you, but it is important to have referees who come from different institutions. So not only the institution where you did your PhD, and you usually should be able to, and you know, I admit that this can be difficult, but you can, particularly with your examiners, you can write to them and ask them. American examiners in particular are very used to this kind of thing, because they work on a committee system where the committee examines the thesis as well, and they're used to supporting their students through the first few years of their academic life. It's also helpful if you do some research into the department that is advertising the position, so that you know something about that position, that department. Do you know anybody in it? Do you know what are people's interests in the department? What kind of direction does it need to be? Does it seem to be taking? While these things are not so important at the application stage, they do become critical at the interview stage if you get to that point. So we've often had situations where candidates have come along to the interview and they've shown that they have taken an interest in the department. They know who's who, they know who does not what, they know whose interests theirs might align with. We've also had candidates who've come to the interview and clearly don't have a clue about the department, and that doesn't look good. Finally, on this point, you're not sure if you want the job. My advice is always apply anyway. Any practice is good practice, and you can decide if you want the job when you've been offered the job. Not much point in deciding whether you want the job before you've been offered the job. And it's always worth applying, because one thing about jobs, like lottery tickets, if you haven't got one, if you haven't got a job application in, you're not going to be offered the job. If you haven't got a lottery ticket, you're not going to win the lottery. So it's a very similar thing. So my advice is always apply, because it's always good practice. And I'm going to stop sharing the screen now and just see if there are any questions on that. Any questions? Because I can see you now. Laurence.
I was wondering if you have any advice for people on how long you should keep using those examiners, because if you're 10 years past your PhD, it's probably time for some new ones, right?
It's definitely time for some new ones if you're 10 years past your PhD. I mean, I think for someone who's, if you're doing your PhD, your examiners are a good option. I mean, if you've just done your PhD in the last, say, 3 to 5 years. Beyond that, it's getting a bit more dubious, and so is your supervisor getting a bit more dubious. Like, we do have people who are still using their supervisors 20 years down the track, but I think that's a bit weird personally. I mean, if you're in a postdoc, obviously you've got CIs that you can, or, you know, whoever your supervisor in your postdoc is, that you can use as your referees as well. And it's worth thinking about who the best referees are, in terms of, you know, who they know, what do they know about the place you're applying for, that kind of thing. But yeah, you're right. I mean, using examiners is good, probably. Depends a bit on how much contact you maintain with them. Like, some people can maintain quite close contact with their examiners for quite some years and possibly work with them, and then obviously you can use them in that context. The most important thing is really to have referees who come from different institutions, firstly, and also who know your work well and will be very positive about you. There's always an issue with referees, because American referees in particular tend to be very over the top enthusiastic about everybody they write about. That's much less the case in Europe, and it's much less the case in Australia too. So you just have to balance that. I always feel a bit dubious about American referees if I don't actually know them, because they're so enthusiastic that you don't really, about everybody, you know, no matter what, they're always like that. So yeah, it's always difficult choosing referees, but it is really important, actually.
Jessica has asked here, don't most Australian universities request your current supervisor to be one of your referees?
Yes, if you're applying for a job, obviously having just completed your PhD, your supervisor is the most obvious person. And that's the other thing that you have to balance with it. If you don't use your supervisor, why are you not using your supervisor? Because it looks a bit odd. Okay, so you probably want to explain that in some way. You know, we had a huge fight 2 minutes after I submitted my PhD or something. I don't know, but you should use your supervisor, or yes, Jessica, or your job supervisor. So most jobs do want your current supervisor to comment on you. Not always though. I mean, people do apply for positions in other institutions when they have a position in one institution and they don't want their current institution to know that they're applying for that position. So that can change the dynamics of it. And you can withhold your referees if you want to for those sorts of reasons, until the point that they request your referees, which may be, in academic jobs, the process is usually that referees are invited to comment before the interview. So the referee comments contribute to choice of people for the interview. So you might have, 80 candidates applying for a job. You choose 10 as a long shortlist. You ask for their referees, and then from that you choose 4 or 5 to interview. So you can withhold your referees, but it's always good to have ones that you don't have to withhold as well. Okay. Was there another question? I meant job super. Yeah, okay. That was that. Anything else on this issue? Okay, in that case, I'll go back to the screen sharing. Everyone see that? Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Yes, okay, great. Okay, so I found this actually very recent job advertisement somewhere, I can't remember where now, for a lecturer in applied linguistics at Queensland, if anyone's interested in applying for this. So I thought we'd use this, and I've got another one for linguistics that we advertised at Melbourne a couple of years ago. So it's not current, but just to show you the selection criteria. So the selection criteria are really important. So obviously a PhD in the area, applied linguistics, linguistics or a related field. You can, even if you're more linguistically than applied linguistically oriented, you can still apply for jobs like this, but you're going to have to make the case. So demonstrated evidence of established record of publication in high quality outlets in the field. You can use Scopus or something like that to demonstrate the high quality of your outlets, or you can use citation evidence from Google Scholar or the various other measures. It's always worth emphasizing the high quality nature of the outlets. And I'd always recommend that you, if you're submitting articles, you begin by submitting to, what we consider to be high quality outlets. And that's things in Scopus, for example, that are in the first quartile, Q1, of publications, journals, or in the university presses or the highly regarded Routledge, Palgrave, those sorts of presses in terms of books or chapters. This is something that you really need to be careful about, because things like Cambridge Scholars Press, I think it's called, people often use that to publish in, but it's not considered to be a high quality press because it doesn't necessarily review what's going into it. And that's what's important in academia, is that your research, before it's published, it's been reviewed. Okay, so talk to your supervisor, talk to other colleagues about high quality presses, look at Scopus, determine which are the publications which have the higher qualities. At Melbourne, we have a list of high quality journals, but it doesn't really work very well because there's a lot of discussion about it, and people always want the journals they publish in to be high quality, of course. So it's better to have a sort of external reference to that kind of thing. So the next one is evidence of ongoing research projects, including plans for external funding applications. So you need to be able to show that you've got research projects which are continuing, and you need to understand about external funding applications. What is the availability of external funding? How do I get it? When will I be in a position to apply for it? Many universities, when you first start, they have internal funding schemes that you can apply to, usually competitively, to get funding for a project which you can then apply for external funding for. But you do need to show that you've got an understanding of how funding works and the nature of ongoing research projects. And these don't need to be individual research projects. They can be things that you're doing with other people in other universities, and that's absolutely fine. Evidence of high quality tertiary teaching experience of applied linguistics at undergraduate or postgraduate level, including course coordination and initiating and developing course materials. This is going to depend a bit on the kind of experience you've had, but certainly we always try to ensure that all our students have some level of teaching experience at tertiary level, so that when they come to it, I mean, and that's why postdocs are encouraged to teach as well, because it's very difficult to apply for a job if you've had absolutely no teaching experience. One thing you can do, which some universities offer, is undertake a certificate or diploma in tertiary teaching or tertiary education, which universities often run themselves. But any kind of evidence that you can bring to that is important. And the high quality, of course, you can use your student evaluations to reflect that. Capacity to implement alternate modes of teaching, blended or flexible learning. If you don't know what blended and flexible learning is, find out, because it's not going to go anywhere anytime soon. And it's, given the pandemic environment that we're all living through at the moment, this is likely to become a really important mode of teaching, and you're going to need to be able to do it and understand it and have ideas about it, etc. So if you're not familiar with it, any of you who've been teaching in the last year obviously will be familiar with it. It is important that you know that. Imagine that in your interview, you're likely to be asked questions about each of these selection criteria. Superior interpersonal communication skills, hopefully you show that through your teaching reviews, but also through the letter that you write and your response to the selection criteria. And ability to work in a culturally diverse environment, well, you should all be fine on that, because you can all refer to all the people that you've been working with from culturally diverse environments. Those are the essential criteria, and those must be answered specifically one by one in your response to the selection criteria. And it's always best, in my view, to have a separate response to the selection criteria and not to put it into a massively long letter that you put in for your application. The desirable ones are things that they would hope that you might have. They're not so important, but you should also address these, although perhaps more minimally than the other lot. An active and effective record of contributing to the effective supervision. That's a very bad sentence, isn't it? Effective supervision of research high degree students. So if you've had any experience with RHD students, that's a good thing. That might be, if you have not actually had supervision experience, you might want to talk about mentoring experience that you've had with research students and that kind of thing. Obtaining and successfully managing external competitive research funding will depend a lot, I think, on what stage of your career you're at. And if you haven't got external funding, you can always talk about managing smaller grants that you've had internally, and ability to maintain confidentiality and demonstrated accuracy and attention to detail. I'm sure you can all respond to that in some way. So I'm now going to stop and see if there are any questions again.
There's one here from Daya. She says, for an academic job, do all reference letters come from an academic institution, or can they be from other professional experience?
It's better if they come from an academic institution. You could have one come from professional experience if they've requested 3 referees. Normally people will request 2 referees or 3 referees. And if you've got the option of putting in 3 referees, then it's probably worth, and you've got 1 professional reference you want to put in, then you could put in 1, but preference will be given to the academic referees. Anything else? Is that from you, Rosie, the era list?
Yeah, just in case. Sometimes those links are harder to find. So.
Kathy has a question here. It says, how do you demonstrate communicative skills or working in a culturally diverse environment?
Well, you tell them about what, I mean, if you do research with, for example, as you do, Kathy, with Aboriginal people, then you can talk about that, because obviously you've been working in a culturally diverse environment. Other people can do it by virtue of the colleagues that they work with who may be culturally diverse. I mean, you demonstrate through your letters and through the way you write, and you may have comments that you can use from student evaluations or presentations that you've given and that kind of thing. Is that helpful?
Can I just add to that, that if you're not Australian, the fact that you're functioning in Australian academia is already sort of demonstrating your experience with the culturally diverse, because it's also your culture.
Exactly, exactly. And I think, you know, most people these days are in universities anyway, are working in fairly culturally diverse contexts. I should correct, I said Scopus before. I did mean, of course, Scimaggio, as Rosie has mentioned. Okay, so those are just, those two things, Scimaggio and the ERA journal list, are just useful places to find out how well thought of particular journals are, that you can use that to support your application. Okay, anything else? Okay, now let's share screen again. Okay. So this is the did I miss one there? No. This is the level B that was advertised a couple of 3 years ago at Melbourne, continuing position. And the criteria, as you can see, were fairly similar. Here, completed PhD, expertise in descriptive and theoretical linguistics. So they're specific here about the kind of person that they want, a strong record of research and a developing publication profile, ability to teach across different levels. You probably won't have had this amount of experience, but you can leverage off the experience that you have had, and they've got specific areas they want to be taught, and you should be able to teach at least 2 of those. Demonstrated capacity to attract research grants and consultancies, and these, because they don't mention external funding, these can be internal funding grants, and you've probably had things during your PhD that you can refer to there. Ability to supervise honours and research higher degree students, and again, excellent communication skills and demonstrated ability to work as part of a team. And that's a fairly easy one to talk about, I would imagine, working as part of a team. Then the desirable criteria, again, experience in field work and language documentation, corpus-based and/or quantitative approaches to linguistic analysis, ability to develop research synergies aligning with current research strengths and strategic priorities, which does mean that you need to have looked at the department and see who's there and see what's going on and see what interests people have. Capacity to build local and international networks and partnerships. And you can refer to that, I'm sure, in some way. Any questions?
There's one here in the chat that says, in the US, they often ask for diversity and inclusion statements where you explain how you'll contribute to an inclusive department. Is that sort of thing as important in Australia too?
I've never seen an Australian job that has asked for that. I know they do ask for that. In the American application system is actually very different from the Australian application system, and you're likely to have to produce a lot more information, and it's often held in a central spot. And then, you know, you might have to include writing samples and examples of publications and statements about your teaching philosophy and statements about diversity and inclusion and that kind of thing. We don't tend to ask for that much in Australia. Okay, anything else? Okay, out of curiosity, how would a white male show they contribute to diversity? That's a good question. I mean, talking about places you've worked where you have, you know, diverse people from different backgrounds, if you've done research with communities outside of your own, talking about that kind of thing, you know, you need to demonstrate an openness to diversity and cultural difference. And all you can do is to do that in a statement. Does that help? Yes, thanks. You can speak, you know.
Yeah, I was just really curious, like I'm a female, but I was just kind of going like, what would a white male be able to, you know, kind of say if they, yeah, but that would make sense with like the, like kind of talking about experiences that you've had, like working with, you know, a diverse kind of cohort of people and so on.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And most people have done that through, you know, I mean, undergraduate degrees these days have huge, and actually postgraduate degrees to some extent as well, have huge amounts of group work. And that's very, very often with culturally diverse groups.
Yeah.
Right. So you can refer to how you worked with those groups, how you managed them or didn't manage them or whatever. So I'm sure in this day and age, most people have got some examples of how they can do that.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks. Yeah.
Okay. Right. I will go on. Okay. So as I've said several times, make sure you address all the selection criteria, essential and desirable, with more weight, obviously, to the essential. And be positive about it. So think about the statements that you're putting in. So rather than saying, you know, while I have not yet published results from my work, you can say something like, I'm currently in the process of publishing my results. And, you know, what are your plans? I will be submitting to this journal and that journal. You know, so try and keep everything as positive as you can. And if you have never taught postgraduate students, you can talk about the extensive experience you've had teaching undergraduate students at all levels, including third year and honours and that kind of thing. So just be positive about what you're saying. I'm not familiar with funding schemes in Australia. Well, if you're not familiar with them, you should be. So find out about them. And I will be applying for a DECRA. I put this in because this is not a great look in when you're applying for a job. So if people are looking for someone who's going to be investigating external funding and they're thinking about offering you a job as a teaching and research academic, they may not be thrilled at the idea that you're going to apply for a DECRA and take 3 years off in a research only position. So I would think this may not be attractive to your potential employer. So maybe you can say, I have plans to apply for a discovery grant in the next 2 years rather than a DECRA. And then if you do get the job, you can always discuss the option of a DECRA and see what people think about applying for a DECRA. I mean, it does happen, you know, people do apply for DECRAs and apply for jobs at the same time and get the DECRA, and sometimes they get offered the job and they can take the DECRA and backfill that, and that job can be backfilled by a 3-year position, but it's unusual. So I'd be very careful about saying, I want to apply for a DECRA, because if they're looking for reasons not to interview people, that might be one of the reasons. And, you know, I've sat on probably 100 selection committees, but they're all very different animals. So I can't predict what other universities and other committees are going to be looking for and what kind of criteria they're going to use to exclude people from the interview process. Okay, so all of those things are important to keep in mind.
Can I please ask something?
Of course. I don't know who you are. Can you say
this is Maddie.
Sorry?
My name's Maddie.
Oh, hi. Hi, Maddie.
Hi. So a lot of the times when I've done, resume things, they say when you address the selection criteria, use a STAR example, your situation, task, action, and response. And I'm finding that when using that, it just blows the writing into such a lengthy document. How would you best address the questions? Because sometimes you just feel like you're just repeating yourself and you're not actually putting in anything that is, I guess, informative, when you could kind of just speak out a result that you achieved and everything else would be gathered.
Well, that would be the approach I'd adopt. I think that's very public servant type of approach to selection criteria. And I think we're much less likely to use it in academia. I know that I've got young friends applying for jobs, and that's the kind of approach that they use. But I think it's very easy to write a massively long application, which is very repetitive, and it's probably going to be, if you've got a very long application, it's going to be skimmed rather than read. So I stick to just trying to get the I can't remember what those 4 points you made were now, but just trying to get across the answer to the question that they're asking in that selection criterion.
Okay, thanks. Good to know.
That makes sense?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Curriculum vitae there's one thing I want to say about curriculum vitae. Obviously, you're going to use the same or a similar curriculum vitae for all the jobs that you're applying for. And so it's really important to keep this up to date as much as you can. But one thing I do want to say about it is that in applying for a job, make sure that your letter of application, your selection criteria, and your curriculum vitae are all done in a similar format with the same font. So it looks like a cohesive group of documents. It doesn't look like you did your CV for some job, last year at a different place and it was a completely different format. So I think it's really important to have a neat CV. And I'd avoid using, lots of lines and big headings and different fonts and stuff like that. Just the information you want to get across is important, and it's important enough in its own right not to have to be kind of couched in multiple fonts and underlines and bold italics. You can use some of that obviously for headings and things, but just be careful that it doesn't end up looking really messy. So it needs to include obviously contact details, your phone number, your email address, and your regular address. You should summarize your education first, your PhD, its topic. What is it? A PhD in linguistics, in applied linguistics, in education, whatever it's in. If you've done an MA, include that as well. Indicate whether it was a thesis or was it coursework plus a thesis, or coursework only, and your BA, and you should put the dates that each of these things took place, so PhD 2012 to 2016 or whatever, MA, 2010 to 2011. So the dates for each of those, and just it can be very short, like a couple of lines each, just the title of the PhD, because that's important and indicates where you're coming from, and possibly who your supervisor was, And then with the MA and the BA, just, you know, the general information about those. Your employment history should start from your most recent position and move back to your first position. Where it was, the dates it occurred. Usually the dates are on the left-hand side of the page, and the information is, or at least this is how I do it, dates on the left-hand side of the page, information on the right-hand side at a tab mark. So when the job was, where it was, and what you were in that position. You don't need to give a whole lot of detail about what you did there, particularly if it's an academic job. You can include periods where you didn't work. You know, if you went off and traveled for a year, that's perfectly okay as well. And you can put that in. It should cover most of the time that you've been since your completion of your PhD, or possibly before that when you worked. It can include obviously periods of work during your PhD, and you can indicate whether it's full-time or part-time as you wish. Your teaching experience, just summarize what courses you've taught and indicate what kind of evaluations they got. If you want to write a couple of sentences about the course content, also that's fine, depending on how much you've got. Your publications are usually, certainly in Australia, and I'm not sure the extent to which this is the case elsewhere, but certainly in Australia, your publications will be closely scrutinized. So my suggestion is that unless you've got fewer than, I don't know, 9 or 10 publications, that you put them under these different headings. But that does depend a bit on how many publications you've got. Put them neatly in date order, so most recent first again, and highlight, if any of those publications were invited publications, highlight which ones were invited publication. And you should keep track also of your presentations, the date, the title, what conference it was at, and which of these were invitations. And if you want, if you've got several, you can put the invited ones first and then put the just regular conference presentations after that. And the same sort of thing with the grants, what it was, how long it was for, how much it was for, just basic information. Have you had any prizes? You can put these either here or you could put them further up if you prefer. And then your referees, if you're prepared to say who your referees are. Now I'm sure there'll be questions, so I'm going to stop again and see what questions there are. No questions on CVs? All quite straightforward.
Do you have any suggestions on what sort of length an early career researcher might be looking for in their CV? It seems like these can be incredibly long documents, but that's not necessarily a good thing.
I think at an early career researcher level, it's probably not going to be more than 4 pages, might be 3. I mean, certainly out there in the real non-academic world, they talk about CVs should never be more than 2 pages. But, you know, because what's important for us is publications and presentations and that kind of thing, it's obviously going to be more than that. But I think it's important not to pad it out so that it's even longer than that. Rosie, you've recently applied for a position. How long was your CV?
I just opened it up to check. It was 8 pages.
Oh, there we go. But you're an exception.
Mine is A2.
I did have a question maybe to follow on from that, actually, because one thing that I always struggle with whenever I'm updating my CV is sort of how to include stuff like engagement and outreach and things like that, which is often asked about now in key selection criteria and things like that. But I never quite know how to neatly organize it. At the moment, I've kind of got a heading that's community engagement and outreach, and I've sort of got it broken down into community collaboration, education outreach, and then media, but I've never been quite happy with how to do that. So I wonder what you see from other people's, and if there's anything that committees like or dislike in that area.
To be honest, I've seen hardly any of that in the selection committees I've sat on, and I think that's partly because it's very recent, this thing, like the ARC's recently started talking about impact, and so everybody's started talking about impact, you know. I mean, it really is, that's something that if it's a selection criteria, you can just write it in a paragraph type of thing. I'm not sure I'd worry too much about including it in your CV, or if you do, just briefly, and you can always highlight that kind of thing, because that actually is a good way to address the diversity inclusion type criteria as well. You can always include stuff on that in your application letter. Laurence, you've got a question?
Yes, I was wondering, because I don't think that in your slide you mentioned anything about putting student supervision or reviewing for journals and other professional service things. So what is your opinion on that? Because I'm thinking that sort of, what I was told to do was put the outreach that Rosie just mentioned in the same section as chairing a session at a conference and reviewing for journals. But I have no idea if that was just that one person's opinion, or if that is a generic accepted standard of doing things.
Look, it doesn't matter. I mean, you can put that, or you can just put a, you know, something in your, I guess it reflects your standing in the field. You can put something in your application letter about that, or you can summarize it in your CV. It's a long time since I've had to do a CV for a job. So,
but you do look at them, right? So would you think that it's a really gaping hole if you see a CV from an applicant that leaves that out?
No, I wouldn't think that was a gaping hole, because I haven't seen a lot of those in applications. But where you, I mean, mainly those things come in your performance reviews once you've got the job, I'd say, more than they do when you're applying for the job. But you can always put a line about those kinds of things in. There's certainly no harm.
Thank you.
It's, I mean, the important thing is really that you don't make it look like padding. Petter had a question.
Hi. I'm just wondering, you're saying things like you can include things like the feedback from your students, things like that, as examples of clear communication or working with diverse people, but do you just put that in the letter that does say I often get feedback that says I'm good at this, or do you actually include the actual feedback that I got? Like, do you attach that as a separate document or something to the...
I would never attach a whole lot of, I mean, when I was talking about feedback from students, I was really talking about the scores that you get on those student evaluation forms. But you can always, the best way actually to deal with comments from students about you is to get your referees to talk about it. That's always a good way to go with that kind of thing. In terms of talking, you know, I mean, the diverse groups of students that we teach these days are a very good way of showing that you're able to work in culturally diverse contexts, because, you know, you don't really get students full of white Anglo-Saxon native speaking classes anymore. Okay. So that, you know, there are a number of ways you can deal with it, and either of those will work really. Oh, there you go. Rosie suggests professional service as a heading. So yeah, that's a good idea. Is there a time limit on when things should be left off a CV? Jessica, what do you mean by that?
Hi. So I was really thinking like, not so much for publications or things, but like presentations or whatever. Is it worth including things from like 5, 10 years ago if we get, once you're that far out from PhDs? Like, do you include every conference you've ever presented at?
No, I'm terribly bad at recording conferences I have attended, so I can hardly ever remember which ones they are, let alone what I did when I was there. But I'm really bad at that, and I shouldn't be as bad. Certainly as you get further down the track, what's going to become important about presentations is going to be presentations that were invited as either plenary or keynote, or presentations in invited symposia and that kind of thing, or invitations to present in a symposium at a conference, and those sorts of things. So you should always leave those in. I'd often advise to separate, once you get further down the track and you've got more invitations, to separate off your invited presentations from your just regular conference presentations. Leaving things off, yeah, I mean, don't leave publications off, but you can leave early presentations that weren't so great off, or local ones. I mean, what you've got to think about what it is you're trying to demonstrate. You're trying to demonstrate that you are working well in an academic environment and you're getting your material, your research, your findings out into the international community. And as you go further down the track, international support from international colleagues is going to become increasingly important. So attendance, although we can't do it at the moment, at international conferences is really critical, because that's how you get to meet people overseas. I mean, many of the people I've used in the past as referees have been people I've met through conferences, who've heard me give talks and who I've subsequently communicated with, but no, I haven't necessarily actually worked with them very closely or anything like that. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, back we go. Hang on. Okay. Sorry, I'm finding it difficult to manage all these different bits. Okay, so I do think the cover letter is really important. Address it to the right person. That may be the selection committee, it may be the person whose name might be mentioned in the advertisement, but make sure you've got the right person. Introduce yourself, be specific about the job you're applying for, and summarize briefly why you think you would be good for that job. Okay, so 4 to 5 lines is probably enough for that. What this letter is trying to do is pick you out of the pack. Okay, so highlight, in terms of your achievements in teaching, research, administration, what are the great things that you've done in the past, and why do you think you'd be a good fit for this particular position, and why do you want to go to this university? Remember that you need to demonstrate not only that I need an academic job, but I really want to work at Queensland University because I know that you have, this centre or that centre, or this person or that person, and that your department does this and does that. And if it's a short-term job, obviously how this fits into your career plans more generally. It is really important to be able to demonstrate that you know something about the place you're applying to, because there's an expectation that that will be the case. Why are you suitable in particular for this position? You need to demonstrate your enthusiasm for the position. And you can end by saying, you know, you'd be very happy to provide any further information they should require, or to, you know, be interviewed by the selection committee or whatever. But don't summarize your CV, because they've got your CV as well. So you need to pick the nuts and bolts out of your CV and the great things that you've done that may not have come into your CV because they were difficult to get in there. Be careful about making unsubstantiated claims about skills that you can't actually demonstrate that you've got, and about making things like, you know, I want to work at your university because it's at the top university in Australia or whatever. You know, don't go there in general. But you know, it's fine to say things like, you know, I find your department really exciting because of this stuff that it's doing, or, you know, because of this approach that it's taken to something or other. So that's great, but don't generalize about the overarching institution. Okay, any questions on that?
There's one from Grant here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in the past, I've been advised that we could send an email before applying to just get an initial sense of if we would be suitable for the position and who to address the cover letter to if it's not clear from the advertisement. So I'm curious what you would think about that.
Look, I think it's fine to do that as long as you've got a really clear reason for doing it and you're not just wasting people's time. It can work for and against you. So you've got to be a little bit careful about it. But certainly people do that to some extent. And I mean, making a phone call to find out about it. If you get to the point of getting an interview, you can always find out. You might do this through HR though. Find out who's on the selection committee, because it's always a useful thing to know who's going to be making the selection. But I don't have any problem with that kind of thing, especially obviously if you know someone there. You've got to be, if you do know people there, you've got to be a bit careful about conflicts of interest with them, because selection committees take that very seriously. So someone who's worked closely with you is not going to be able to be on that selection committee with you for the job that you're applying for, if they're considered to have a conflict of interest with you. But I don't think there's any harm in showing an interest and finding out more, as long as it's not a kind of time wasting activity just so that they've got your name. You follow what I mean?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay. Okay, so, oh, look, there's the question that you just asked. So should I contact the employer informally? Well, yes, do, if you've got sensible questions to ask, and, you know, make it clear who you are, why you're ringing, what your interest is, etc. What font should I use? Well, that's obviously up to you, but just make sure that the same font is used throughout, so that it looks like a cohesive package. Should I include a photo of myself? What do you guys think about that? Is anyone there? Do you put photos of yourself in?
No, I feel if they need to see who I am to hire me, then they're judging me by the wrong criterion.
Yeah, there's quite a few people in the chat who have put no in the chat.
Oh, are there?
There's 5 no's in the chat.
I would agree with this. Don't put, I find photos really annoying, actually. So I would, yeah, obviously, Beatrice, if they ask, you want to put one in, but if they don't ask, I would not put a photo in.
I suppose these days they can just Google you so easily anyway, so if they want a photo.
I put a link into my LinkedIn, and there's a photo of me there if they have to know.
Okay, well, that's another good option for doing that, for dealing with this kind of issue. I'm going to make these more discussion questions now. So I've got rid of the PowerPoint so that I can see you guys. What about gaps in your CV? Do you have gaps in your CVs?
I think there should be a realistic understanding that a lot of people now coming out of PhD are going to have a gap in their CV for a little bit until they get a first job. And I think there's a big fear of having a gap in your CV. But you hear about people once they finish and hand in only getting a job 6, 12, 18 months later. They might just be doing some receptionist work during that time or something. So there is academic gaps at times.
Yes, and I don't think you should worry too much about those academic gaps. I think they're quite usual. I think you should, indicate what you did in that period, but I don't think you should worry about those too much.
So should we include things like carer responsibilities, or like just some kind of general statement about that sort of thing?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you, if you've had a year off for maternity leave, for example, I think it's fine to put that. I think also people tend to be a little bit dubious about it, because then they think, oh, the employer's going to think I'm going to have another baby, and all this kind of stuff. And there's some truth in that. I mean, they're not allowed to think that, but on the other hand, you can't actually legislate for what people are allowed to think. So that's your call, really, is whether you put that in or whether you just put it in as care responsibility and you're not more specific than that.
If someone were to put that in, where would that go in the CV?
Just in your dates normally should add up to, everything. So it would go in wherever it fits in terms of when the break was. I mean, people do have, most people have breaks at some stage or other. Any other questions? Should I include a writing sample? I would suggest that you don't include a writing sample unless you're asked. Often in a job application, there will be, and you'll probably all be aware that the job application process is a long and tortuous one, and you should expect that you're going to have to wait a long time for any outcome. But often people will ask for writing applications after they've, at the point they've got their for writing examples of written work at points where they've got the long shortlist, or even prior to the interview for people on the shorter shortlist. So I personally have never included a writing sample, by which I presume people really mean a publication. But it's up to you. And if you do include a writing sample, my recommendation would be don't include your 100-page article. Okay, do something shorter than that. But generally, I wouldn't include a writing sample.
It was interesting. I just applied for a job recently, and I don't have any published articles at the moment. A lot of that's due to COVID and things like that. And I got feedback from the university saying that even though I have writing in review and they have been submitted and they're just being reviewed and whatnot, they would have liked to see a writing sample.
Oh, okay. Well, that is interesting. Was that a university here?
No, in England for a postdoc position.
Oh, okay.
And because they were done
for a postdoc position, that is more critical, and especially if you don't have anything that's freely accessible to people, that you put something.
I think it's an extreme circumstance, though, not having anything published, so they can at least see your writing style.
Yeah, I'm also a bit surprised they didn't ask you, actually.
Could you include just an abstract or something that you've submitted for a conference, or
no,
count as a writing sample?
No, that doesn't count as a writing sample. an abstract is a very particular beast.
I don't think it is that unusual to not have any publications out of your PhD though, Maddie, because it really depends on the sort of research that you're doing. If separate chunks of research that are publishable separately. I tested all these Dutch immigrants and I finished testing 3 months before my PhD was due. I didn't have time to turn them into papers before I submitted my PhD. But then when I applied for a postdoc, they asked for a sample of my writing. And I said, look, I can send you my thesis that is under review if you like, but it's big. But they were happy for me to send it. But I figured I'd better give them the option before I spam them and plug up their NBN. But at least they asked. But for you, they never asked until it was too late, I gather.
Yeah, I'm a bit surprised they didn't ask. And it actually sounds a bit like they were looking for an excuse.
It was actually more of
feedback.
Yeah, I think they had such a volume of people submitting, and the reason why I was actually given feedback is because I knew somebody on the panel, so I wouldn't have actually received any feedback. That was something that they had mentioned, because there was no writing sample and no publication, it was one of the bigger reasons why I was just I didn't even get an interview. Because they so it was suggested that if you don't have any publications and there's nothing, then get given a sample.
Okay, well, that's reasonable. If you don't have any publications, give them a sample, but don't make it a massively long sample.
No.
Can I ask a question about writing samples as well?
Sure. Hi, Sasha.
Hi. Can you have a co-author, or does it have to be like single author?
No, you can have a co-author, but you should be the first author.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. But
do you need to indicate like what your contribution versus theirs is?
Yeah, it's a good idea to do that. It's a good idea to do that. I mean, it's very common in the States, particularly, where if you publish something, you publish it with your supervisory committee or your supervisor or whatever. So it's fine to have a co-author, but indicate that, this was 80% yours or 70% yours or whatever. And that you were the lead author on it and you managed the whole process and that kind of thing. But yeah, absolutely. And that's another way of showing that you can collaborate with other people and work with other people and work as part of a team and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So all of those things are important. Anything else? What were we talking about? Oh, the writing sample, yes. Yeah, so a tricky one, but your decision really on whether to include that. I think one thing that you have to be really careful about these days is that jobs are so competitive now that having publications is really important. And so the sooner you can get something out for publication, really the better. And a good time to do that is in between that, which is probably the last time you feel like doing it, is in between that period when you submit and when you get your examination reports. Okay, but it is crucial. It's one of the first things that people look at is how many publications, and can we see evidence of a trajectory, if this is an academic position, for where this person is going to be in, say, 5 or 10 years' time, particularly if it's a continuing position. I always suggest to people that a good pattern to work by is that you've got 2 publications which you have currently submitted to journals, and this is in any 1 year, 2 publications that 2 publications that are coming out in journals, because you submit to a journal, but it can take a long time before they come out after that. So 2 publications that have been accepted, 2 publications that are currently under review with a journal, and 2 publications that you're working on, just as a kind of ballpark figure for how to go. That's quite a high bar, but something along those lines that you're able to show that you've got this forward movement at all times, if you see what I mean. Okay, so we'll leave publications now. Who should I include as my referees and how many? Don't include more than they ask for. So if they ask for 2 referees, you only give them 2. If they ask for 3, you only give them 3. Don't ever give them 6 because they're just going to choose them and they might not choose the best ones. You're the best person to choose the best ones. Does the committee usually prefer candidates with more sole authored papers or co-authored papers, or a mixture of both? Well, the problem here is the committee doesn't exist. There are multiple committees and they all have different views about what they expect. I always think it is important to have some sole authored papers because those are the ones that really demonstrate who you are. But obviously, co-authored papers is good as well. Depending, and you're right, Laurence, it depends a lot on the field you're in. So in some fields, you just don't publish prior to your PhD without your supervisor. And that's not the case in other fields. So it's a balancing act between those 2 things, and also depends on the field. But you can assume that, you know, if you're applying for a position, for example, in phonetics, that they're going to know that their norm is to publish with other people, okay, with your supervisor or whatever. You don't need to really tell them that because that is the norm in that field, but it's not the norm in all areas of linguistics. But, you know, a mixture is always good, but certainly a sole publication or 2 is useful for demonstrating that you can do stuff on your own. I'm always a little bit dubious if there's not if you know, you've got someone 5 years out of a PhD and there's nothing sole authored. So it's good to have something. Okay. So I've talked quite a lot about referees. Are you happy for me to leave referees now? Yeah. Okay.
Can I ask a brief question about the referees?
Yeah.
I have previously found myself in this weird situation where when I applied for a job with my previous PhD supervisor, they would have been the most logical referee, but they're also the one hiring someone. So you can't really use them.
Oh, well,
like what?
you can use them, but in a sense, it's a bit of a waste of a referee because if your supervisor is on the selection committee, is that what you're talking about? They were on the selection committee. Presumably, they're going to support you anyway. But if they're really the best, if you've only just finished the PhD and they're really the best person to be your referee, you should put them down. But you could maybe put a note saying, you know, if you prefer me to find another referee, I can, or tell them that, you know, or talk to them about it.
Yeah, because I was, when I left them off, it felt like a red flag, as in, why are you not putting them? But
did you talk to your supervisor about that?
No, because this was with Anne. And she was looking for a postdoc, and she would have been my my referee, but she was the person potentially hiring me. So that was very weird. Also addressing the letter. It's like, dear Anne, dear Professor Cutler, like what do you put? It was just awful. Because I don't know, where do these letters go, right? They go to HR, they go to everywhere.
Okay, I'll tell you how to deal with this. Always say, dear Professor Cutler.
Yeah, I did. Luckily.
And always talk to her about the best way to go with it.
Yeah.
First, okay?
I should have done that. Luckily, I
should have done that.
So it might have worked, but okay.
Yeah, I mean, these are formal letters and they go to all sorts of people. So make the addressee, formalize the addressee as well.
But so it wouldn't look like a red flag if you leave the person off, if the other people know that that person is on the committee then?
Well, it wouldn't look like a red flag if you talk to Anne about it first.
Yeah. Yes. Okay, thanks.
So I'd always suggest, you know, communication's always the best way to go with these things, actually. Okay, what about, so, you know, you've done all this, oh, hang on, are citation counts important for recent graduates? The answer to that's really no. Citation counts don't really become important until at least 10 years out, because they take so long to crank up, unless you happen to be in a science area where you did something absolutely amazing and it's got thousands of citations by the end of year one. Very unusual in our field though. So I'll just spend the last 15 minutes talking about the interview. So you put in your application. It's been a fantastic application. You've been chosen for interview. You've been invited for interview. Hopefully COVID has disappeared off into another world and you can actually physically go for interview. Obviously, it's very different if you can't. If you can't, it's just going to be done online and it's much more difficult. What should you expect in an interview? How long will it be? And will they pay your airfare? The answer to will they pay your airfare is yes, they should. And if they don't, you don't have to go. Although I have heard of people who've paid their own airfare in order to ensure that they get a face-to-face interview. That was before COVID though. How long will the interview be? It's usually 45 minutes to an hour, depending. At Melbourne, for a continuing position, we always invite all the candidates to come for interview. We often do what we call a first interview by Skype, and then we determine from Skype, the Skype interview or Zoom or whatever, which of those candidates we prefer, and then we might invite 2 or 3. Because we're so far away and we're often looking at paying airfares from Europe or the US, we might invite 2 or 3 in the same week to meet with the committee, with postgraduate students, with other members of staff, to give a seminar and to have an interview. And you should expect at the very least, you'll be invited to give a seminar and have an interview. And, you know, we would do something like set it up so that you'd have lunch with the head of school. At some point, you'd have lunch or dinner with the postgraduate students. You'd have lunch or dinner with the staff while you're there. You'd give a seminar. The staff will give feedback on that seminar to the people on the selection committee, and you'll have an interview, and you'll also usually be given a spot to sit where people can come and talk informally to you. Because the most important thing, and I always say this on selection committees, the most important thing in choosing someone for a position, and particularly for a continuing position, this is worth thinking about, is this is going to cost you millions of dollars. So if you employ someone at 40 into a continuing position, you're talking about a very large investment in that person. So you want to have the right person. And what do you think the most important criterion is?
Fit.
Fit. Keep going.
They get along with other people in that culture already.
Say that again, Lucy.
That they get along with, yeah, basically just fit. Yeah, they get along with people already in that community.
It really is that they're a nice person who's going to be great to work with. That actually is far more important than anything else, because if you get a difficult person into a job that's a continuing job, it can really step up that whole department very easily. And, you know I've been through the experience where that's happened. So the reason for having all these more informal get-togethers is to really get to know the person. And I think all the better universities are likely to do that. And it's equally important for you to know that level of detail about them in terms of determining whether you think you'll take that job or not. Imagine a situation which I had a few years ago where I was asked to be on a selection committee for another university. And it was for an associate professor level position, and it was continuing. And they had 4 candidates for this position, all of whom came not from Australia. So they flew all of these candidates in. And I was really shocked by the fact that all they did with those candidates was give them a 45-minute interview on one day, and that was it. They didn't show them around the university. They didn't introduce them to other people. They didn't ask them to give a talk or anything. They just brought them in, gave them a 45-minute interview, and then sent them back to their hotel. And I thought, why would you ever take a job in a university like that? So it is important that you know where you're going to. How is a comparison made between a recent PhD graduate and someone who has finished a PhD earlier? Obviously, someone who's finished the PhD earlier has a stronger resume. How will this difference be taken into consideration to ensure fairness? I'm not quite sure what you mean by ensuring fairness. I mean, I know in theory what you mean about it, but the reality of that situation is that the PhD person out of their PhD longer has got more experience and therefore more ability to demonstrate how they meet the selection criteria. Okay, so the likelihood is that they'll be able to make a better case for getting that job because they've already got rungs on the ladder, as it were. And that, I'm afraid, is, just the reality of that situation. It's the same as if you think about it, applying for DECRAs, the ARC Early Career Researcher grants. I always suggest that you wait to apply. You're only allowed to apply twice for a DECRA, and my suggestion would always be not to apply before your third year out, because you simply don't have the rungs on the board before you've been out 3 years. 3 years gives you time to have some publications out, to have developed your profile a bit, to have worked independently, done a bit of teaching, perhaps done a bit of supervision, etc., etc. The reality is that if you've got more rungs on the board, you are able to make a better case. And that's just the facts of the matter. Sorry, Layla, it's probably not what you wanted to hear, but it's the way it is. And it's especially so in a very competitive job market. So for you guys, the important thing is to maintain your profile as best you can and publish as soon as you can from your PhD or from your postdoc or from wherever you are. And even if you don't immediately get a job, and this is really important actually, even if you don't immediately get a job, don't give up on publications, because if you give up on publications, you're going to seriously disadvantage yourself down the track. Okay. Okay, any other questions from anyone? How did you find this?
It was really interesting. Yeah.
I thought this was really helpful and a good format too.
I find it refreshing that it wasn't one of those anxiety-inducing, it's a hopeless mess out there, don't even bother, because I've been to way too many of those. So this was actually lovely, Jill.
Very true. It was positive and constructive.
Well, I think that's how you've got to think about it. And I think, you know, you may well have a period where you're either having, I mean, well, I'll tell you about when I finished my PhD, I did my PhD in first language acquisition, right? Trust me, nobody wanted to employ anyone in first language acquisition. So I applied for a position in the Language Testing Research Centre at the University of Melbourne. I knew nothing, not a single thing about language testing, but I had the stats, right? Because I'd done first language acquisition and I'd done some psych in my degree and that kind of stuff. And so I got the job. So it was great. But you know, you may have to look a bit further than the traditional academic job, at least initially. And if you can get into something that's going to allow you to support your publication record, then that's great. And that's what that job did for me. It was fantastic for getting publications, even though it was moving into an area which I wasn't really completely enamored of. But I did work in that area then for 10 years after that, before I moved into the work with Indigenous kids. So yeah, you know, it's sometimes you've got to take a bit of a sidestep in order to get to where you want to get to. But you know, you're a great bunch, and I'm sure you'll do well. And I'm certainly happy to, if you want to email me and ask me to look at something or whatever, I'm happy to do that. Look at your CV, give you ideas, whatever. So feel free to do that if you want to.
Thanks, Jill.
Thanks, Jill.
Okay. Good. Okay. Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. I hope you all get jobs as soon as you can. There is that applied linguistics job that's going. I can't remember what the deadline date is, but certainly I'll tell you in a sec. If any of you are applied linguists, you might want to think about it if you are keen on going to Queensland, and Queensland's a pretty good university. Don't say that in your application. What's the deadline? Don't know, I can't find the deadline. You have to look at the UQ. I can't find the deadline, but it must be on the UQ website somewhere if you want to apply for it. Okay, so happy to advise you if and when you want to be advised about anything. Okay.
Thank you so much, Jill.
No worries.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Amanda,
Jill.
just before you upload this thing, can you just talk to me about it?
Sure.
Okay, so
Okay, bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks.